Hello and welcome to the Barcast. I'm your host, Nick Barr, coming to you on a Thursday morning and carrying on with our translation project of 27 Personalities in Search of Being by Claudio Naranjo. And we're on to the sexual six, whose keyword is fuerza. And so we'll go through this chapter remembering that the passion of the six is fear. And right off the bat, we've got some work to do. And here's the so-called counterphobic character. The sexual six goes against fear. We could call this neurotic need strength. Descriptively, we can say strong in the same way that we might label a conservation six as weak. One is like a rabbit and the other is like a bulldog. A counterphobic is very much like a barking dog. He doesn't always bite. He barks more than he bites, but he does have a fierce appearance. The need isn't just to feel strong, but also to be able to intimidate. The internal programming says that the best defense is a good offense. A very illustrative joke regarding this, a man visited several psychiatrists because he kept hearing the sound of wings in his bedroom, which prevented him from sleeping. An innovative psychiatrist gave him a gun, telling him that he could end his phobia by shooting, because you know you're stronger. The next thing that happened was a big scandal. The man killed his guardian angel. So these are the people who go against danger, who can kill anyone because anyone could become dangerous. So we'll pause there before moving on to the transformation of the sexual six. So we talked in our introduction to the six about the six having diversity in their subtypes. And we also talked about this phobic versus counterphobic, which is essentially flight or fight response to fear. And so in this introduction, Naranjo's drawing a pretty clear delineation, essentially, as far as I can tell, equating the sexual six with the counterphobic six, which makes sense. And I know there's so much jargon here, which is really unfortunate. But this is not an introduction to the Enneagram. This is sort of advanced. This is grad level Enneagram work. And so the jargon is just part of that, kind of part of the cost of doing business at that level. But just simplifying it, what do we mean by sexual, right? We mean there are three instincts or subtypes: social, sexual, and self-preserving, or sometimes translated here as conservation. And the sexual subtype seeks safety. Their survival strategy is in intense one-on-one interaction. And I would say that one-on-one can sometimes even be with art or a calling, work. So someone who throws themselves into an intense relationship with someone or something. That's what we mean by sexual. And I figure that Ichazo, Naranjo's teacher, is the one who came up with these instincts, and they're not widely used outside of the Enneagram, but I do think that they work. And why is it called sexual? Not you could probably trace the roots there into Freudian stuff with parents and caregivers, right? That sort of essentially latching on to the one parent. And sort of becoming the favorite or entering sort of an intense codependent relationship. Those are all possibilities. But I think self-diagnosis is pretty simple, and I think it can change over time. I'm not particularly committed to someone needing to be one or the other. And I think when it comes to the six, I've heard that Suzanne Stabile, among others, they've kind of loosened up their own perspective on phobic versus counterphobic, thinking of it more as like a dial that someone can go up and down. No, I mean, which makes sense, right? Nobody's always flight or always fight. We move back and forth between them. But for our purposes, are you more wired to throw yourself into the fight or withdraw from the fight? And another thing to bring in here is introversion and extroversion, which I've always been dissatisfied with. never really identified myself as fully introverted or fully extroverted. More on the introverted side. I definitely like to have my alone time, and I get recharged when I'm alone. But I also really get charged up in interaction. But I'm definitely not I'm not a social type. And I think that's been really clarifying for my own work, and I think for many others. We know extroversion. Extroversion is extroversion. Social subtype is social subtype. But what's nice about sexual self-preservation and social, in this, it's 3 instead of 2. And I think it helps clarify some ambiguity around introversion, because some people really do get charged up through self-preservation, i.e. not just alone time, but like cleaning your room, generating wealth, like gathering resources, feeling safe, feeling secure, stability. Those are all a kind of a drawing in that one would call self-preservation. And then some people get their energy through an art practice, intense intellectual work, a really great conversation with a friend, a wild love tryst, a sort of a romp, an affair, and that would be more of the sexual type. That's how I read these. So we're in the sexual 6, and you can feel the way that the sexual 6 is moves into conflict, moves into relationship, wants the sparks to fly, wants there to be fire, and so it's not really surprising that the sexual 6 would be more of a counterphobic type. So let's read the Transformation in the Sexual 6 by Grazia. Wow, this is a great Italian test. I'm going to say this is Ceccini, Ceccini, and I apologize if I'm right, if I'm wrong there. It might be Cecchini, but I'm going to say Ceccini. With contributions from Mireia Aregui and Barbara Grassi. A lot of Spaniards, Italians. It's a European collective, the SAT school that collected all these stories and accounts. So this is the consciousness of passion. The first step toward transforming the counterphobic 6 is not easy. Recognizing oneself as a 6 means coming into contact with the passionate, emotional part, which is fear. To recognize fear as the underlying motivation for behavior and cognitive structure, the counterphobic must take a paradoxical step, feeling the emotion of fear. On an emotional level, the counterphobic feels fear, but this fear is redefined in terms of an obstacle, a limit, and a shameful defect that must be overcome. So again, we're in the head triad, we're in the thinking triad, we're at the core of thinking. So that's a classic example of, not contacting the emotion of fear and rather conceiving of it, externalizing it as an object in the external world. To do this, they develop a series of behaviors aimed at convincing themselves and others that they are not victims of fear. Being discovered as fearful reactivates the feeling of indignity and insecurity that they try to hide through their specific passion strength. So if we wanted to translate this as an imperative, it might be something like, must be strong, can't be weak. And underneath that is a feeling of weakness, of threat, of fear. That's universal among the 6. Remember, the social 6, the keyword there was duty. And that, it was more about must have a role, can't be exposed, must be protected, can't be exposed, right? So duty is a sense of belonging in an institution and an insulation from external threat. Now we're moving into more of I need to muscle up. I need to be strong so that nobody will fuck with me, essentially. The first step to feel insecurity and the sensation of indignity. I love that. Feel the insecurity and the sensation of indignity, blocking any attempt to attribute these feelings to events or people who are guilty of being bad or uncomprehending. Fortunately, life provides many opportunities for this. In my case, the first conscious contact with fear and insecurity occurred at age 17 when I was hit by a car. Barbara sent to boarding school. Mireia, intense contact with fear when her mother was admitted to a hospital. And right, I mean, I think again, the six ought to be available to all of us, and in some ways, that's why I have a hard time connecting it with a personality. But as Richard Rohr says, the 6 has made an art form out of fear. The sexual 6 has made an art form out of must be strong, can't be weak. But we can all remember a moment that we were petrified, really, really terrified, and feeling so small and exposed. And so for the sexual 6, they've done a lot to move away from that feeling of fear. But the work for them to do to start is to recognize how much of their own character and personality that they've developed is in response to that original fear. From a consciousness perspective, the SAT process, and that's the school of Naranjo, and the recognition of the 6 character according to the Enneagram are fundamental. Recognizing that fear is the fundamental neurotic need and that strength is its direct manifestation helps the counterphobic give existential meaning to their way of being, overcoming the obstacle of fear as a symptomatic emotion that must be eliminated. This expands the horizon of consciousness beyond the strictly psychological aspect. It's difficult for a classic psychotherapy approach to focus on this crucial point. That's a really powerful articulation of why the Enneagram is valuable, and why I'm, for example, really going deep on it this year. Recognizing that fear is the fundamental need. The 6 needs to feel fear. This is what I talk about when I talk about the energy source or the battery, or in Enneagram terms, the passion, the addiction. Each type has created its own flywheel of sorts that gives it energy. But of course, the energy that it gets is not, it's not high quality. It's diesel. It's polluted energy. It's not solar energy. And so the work is to first recognize the energy source, the polluted energy source, the diesel energy source. And I think as this section points out, that's a little bit outside of the norm of psychology that might more point to wounds that need to be healed. And so, for instance, a traditional relationship with fear here would be this time I was scared. Now I need to sort of overcome the obstacle of fear, right? A 6 would like that framing. Oh, okay, I need to overcome my fear, especially sexual 6. Overcome my fear, become strong. But the Enneagram points to that's just part of the flywheel. Can't be weak, must be strong. Can't be weak, must be strong. This imperative, and this is Ken MacLeod uses a really different framework here, but to the same end. It's this pattern. It's actually the 6 needs to feel fear to give themselves the energy to be strong. And so bringing awareness to the existential meaning that one gets, the sense of purpose that one's character gets out of this never-ending war, that's kind of the framing for the Enneagram, in the beginning of the Enneagram. So what needs to be overcome is not the feeling of fear. What needs to be overcome is the addiction to this energy source. Once fear is recognized as a passion, the counterphobic individual comes into contact with their true self-deception, strength. So what is strength here? Oftentimes it's cultivated on a physical level, getting strong, muscular, strong. Ichaso, I don't know if it'll come up here, but Ichaso called this strength/beauty because for women, their version of strength may be in aesthetic beauty. That's their kind of armor, their shield, their protector. Whereas for men, it might be more physical, imposing strength. Another characteristic is the cultivation of strength as resistance to fatigue, repression, humiliation, and even pain. This aspect makes them resemble a conservation type 4. So we covered the 4 and the conservation 4. Remember that the keyword there was tenacity, this holding in and this gripping, and essentially this denial of all of this sort of fatigue and pain and humiliation. It's a self-flagellating type. It's a masochistic type. But as pointed out here, the difference is the sexual 6 cultivates strength as an illusion to withstand the other's attack and to combat fear. The 6 is, in general, I think, a thinking type and is in relation to the world of projection. The 4 is way more drawn in. The 6 perceives external threats. The 4 almost can't see the external threats and has to interject. They might feel themselves to be the threat. The difference is that the sexual 6 cultivates strength. However, for transformation to occur, it is necessary to reach deeper levels, recognizing that strength is a substitute identity that feels the deep sense of unworthiness and serves to avoid feeling the need for others. If I'm strong, I won't fall into relationships and I won't be hurt. If I'm strong, I can exist whether or not the other person is in a relationship with me, or even if the other person abandons me. The neurotic illusion of strength is directly connected to the illusion of independence and invulnerability, as well as to the narcissistic trait of megalomania. To deeply penetrate the meaning of strength, it is important to understand what it implies to be a sexual subtype. In the counterphobic, it is not easy to perceive the energy they put into the relationship because they hide it from themselves and others. In reality, their passionate search for strength is intimately linked to the love relationship, attack and flight from intimacy. So it's interesting, this is such a common mechanism that I think it is easy to get confused between not just the self-preservation 4, but the 8, who we haven't touched yet. But the 8 is also wants to avoid any kind of vulnerability by being strong. But I think the difference is that, the section opened up with this mouse and the bulldog. But the bulldog of the 6 is ultimately still a mouse. There is still fear underneath all of this. Now, it sounds like a sexual 6, particularly an unhealthy sexual 6, may not be in contact with that fear, but it's there. It's there just waiting to be discovered. And the 6, I think, really does feel small. The 8 really does feel big, as far as I can tell. So this 6 might be full of bluster, but underneath that there is a small, afraid person. So there's a puffing up, there's an armoring, there's an attacking. But I wonder if we can, it's actually not that hard for others to see through that for a sexual 6. I think my mom is a sexual 6. Certainly is a 6. And we'll probably touch into more nuance when we hit the self-preservation 6. But yeah, I think thinking about, relationship with weakness, I think there is like a attacking quality to the sexual 6, but that attacking quality does sort of expose insecurity simultaneously in a way that the 6 may or may not be in contact with, truly in contact with. I mean, the 6 might even intellectually know, I know I attack because I'm afraid, but is the 6 willing to be with fear? I think that's the really hard work for the sexual 6. It is not easy to recognize accusation as a life philosophy. The cognitive distortion is surely understandable on a rational level, but is the part that most resists change. Yeah, we talked about that in the introduction to the 6, about sort of this paranoid, accusative kind of way of forming the world around one. And again, the phobic 6, a social 6, or I think a self-preservation 6, is going to be pinging the world for threat to avoid it, etc. But the sexual six is actually going to go after it. The sexual six starts from a fundamental distrust of the other, whom they believe will surely harm or deceive them. Therefore, they must prepare with strength not to succumb. But the deep conception that a six has of themselves is that they have caused the other's anger because they have been bad, or because they are not adequate, or not beautiful, or are annoying. And this constantly leads them to reject themselves. So again, there's that guilt that I expressed earlier in a previous video that I'm still trying to feel into, the guilt of the six. The way I read this and understand it is I think I connect with it as a very childlike feeling of fear or of guilt. It's this, I don't completely understand what I'm going, but I have what's happening, but I have a sinking feeling that I'm the cause of it. I'm sorry, is it my fault that mom and dad are angry at each other? Did I do something? This boy hit me. Is it my fault that he hit me? Somebody yelled at me. Did they not like the way I look? That kind of insecurity and fear. In a way, I think it's not as neurotic is maybe not the best word to use here, but what I mean is I think it's very pure. And so I don't think it's, compare that to the self-preservation 4, who maybe has a profound sense of lack. The 4 carries that lack with them. And their external world is formed from that lack. So that's the difference maybe between shame and guilt. There's something wrong with me, and that's my home base. The 6, when we're talking about that being the cause or self-rejection, I don't know if they carry it with them in that same embedded shame way. But there's this fearful guilt in response to situations. I don't know how to exactly wrap that up in a bow, but it's just the difference between carrying fear that one might be the cause of scary situations versus shame at the knowing that one is profoundly broken in a way that is causing problems. So there's shame, knowing, futility, despair, brokenness, and then on the other hand there's guilt, fear, anxiety, self-rejection, wincing, tightening, different. Let's see what else this section has to say about that. Behind the fixation of the accusation is a constant and exhausting search not to be punished, but the accusatory behavior allows the deep belief of being the true culprit, the true bad one, to be covered up. Well, that's beautiful. Yeah, that's a great, cleaner articulation of what I'm talking about here. It's a little Kafka-esque, right? Like the trial, where it's such a brutal book, but it's it's roughly speaking, it's about a character who is on trial and it's not clear for what, and naturally he's protesting his innocence because he didn't do anything, but he kind of knows he did do something, in the same way that it's if you get it speaks to a universal human condition, I think, as the 6 does in general, fear of a police officer yells across the street, hey you turn around with fear. What did I do? Right? I hope I'm not caught. I hope I'm not arrested. But your response is immediately one of fear. And that's an exhausting way to live. So it's almost like for the sexual 6 or the 6 in general, that hey you, the world is always sort of in that mode, the police officer mode. Hey you, don't punish me, don't attack me. but they don't feel completely exempt from guilt. They don't have this, yes, how can I help you? No, sir, I wasn't at the crime. They kind of feel like they were in the crime. They want to get off scot-free. They want the crime to be covered up, and they don't even know quite what the crime is. Different than the 4. The 4 is not on a search not to be punished. The 4 is punishing themselves pretty regularly and punishing those around them. For the counterphobic, the monster is God's punishment and the consequent expulsion from paradise. This rejection by God has been the original indelible punishment, and they have no other possibility than to project it outside of themselves onto another guilty party. That reminds us of, again, fear and angst was the alternate that I shared around the core passion of the 6, and angst, following Russ Hudson, as this post-God condition that society is in. When we no longer hear the voice of God, we've lost connection with God, and we're adrift. We're rejected. We've fallen from Eden, and that's scary. So that angst is the ground for the 6's existence. We'll keep going here. Yeah, so, I think this is common across all types, but the counterphobic 6 must recognize their inner child, who needs affection and tenderness and who's afraid. The most substantial change is the integration of good and bad within oneself and the other. It is abandoning the illusion of finding the other totally good person in life, and therefore reliable and not dangerous. It's abandoning the project of categorization. This is good, this is bad, they are good, they are bad, I am good, you are bad, I am bad, you are good. There's a wholeness when one integrates good and bad within oneself. Mention of the Gestalt hot seat. The hot seat reveals the defense mechanism of projection and cognitive generalizations. The truth is that they're afraid of freedom. And we see this throughout the 6, right? Well, living in the wide open post-God space where there is no external authority, that's radically exposed. And so first one has to get more comfortable with fear through connecting with those early fearful memories. Then once that capacity is there, one can learn to feel fear in that angst, that anxiety that one is living with. And then once that capacity is there, then one starts to move into courage, which is the redemptive virtue of the 6. I think this section talks a little bit about courage. Overall, this text doesn't do much about the passions into the redemptive virtues. But I think this section has here the virtue courage. Courage is a word that a counterphobic does not deeply feel until they experience that the only way to get rid of the anguish of life is action. I just think that the passion redemption arc is just so brilliant in the Enneagram. And here we have an example of how hard it is to do, because the sexual 6 is starting with a near enemy of courage, which is strength or shielding, might. Fuerza can be used, strength and might interchangeably here. So it's the quelling, that conception is the absence of fear. Whereas how many famous quotes are there around how we relate to fear? Courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is including fear and showing up and being able to act anyway. It is not important to act rightly, but to act. For the counterphobic, courage means deciding on an action, making a mistake, not defending oneself from the error, not accusing oneself or the other, accepting the consequences. It is important for someone to accompany them in decision-making so that they can verify that the error is not fatal, that it can be recomposed, that they can apologize. One can fall without dying and without getting hurt. This was my most important discovery in martial arts practice. They need to experience that anguish disappears when they act, and not when they have acted correctly. Disarming oneself is also courage in the face of the pain of the love relationship. Disarming oneself to open up to tenderness. The sexual six has the neurotic illusion of being spontaneous. That's interesting. Only the deep experience of spontaneity puts the counterphobic in a position to recognize their inhibition in the face of spontaneous action. So there's some freezing for all six types. But I think, again, the sexual six, in a way, has the hardest job because of their counterphobic nature, because of their denial and sort of conflicted relationship with fear. They're going to show up as strong when they feel weak. They're going to show up as brave when they're actually afraid. They're going to show up as spontaneous when they're actually frozen. So they've got to undo these illusions and then move forward. Interesting note here, if you're trying to type yourself, that it's easier for a sexual six to express anger in social relationships than in intimate ones. So anger is not easily expressed in the context of the intimate relationship. Again, pleasure, sensuality, eroticism. What's being brought up here is, again, you'll see a lot of sort of near enemies of that. So they might be seeking sensuality, but do they experience real pleasure, true pleasure? The sexual six will likely, upon reflection, realize that no, because of the difficulty they have in surrendering to the other. So trust and faith are at first difficult for the counterphobic six to contact. And again, there's a shared aspect with the eight. The eight does not trust easily. But again, I think the difference here is that for the six, how can I trust another when I don't trust myself? The eights trust themselves, I think. Eights are strong. Eights feel a deep sense of capability and strength and passion and they've got a can-do attitude. They've got a lot of energy. But they're a little bit like wrecking balls. Stay the F out of my way, right? So there's that strength there. Now, is there vulnerability that they're not willing to touch? Of course that's there. But the six is way more impacted by their fear and their lack of trust, first of all, in themselves. And again, they're still feeling that loss of separation of the paternal God, the external authority figure. They're still reeling from that separation. So the six doesn't trust themselves. And so the reasons why a six doesn't trust and an eight doesn't trust are completely different. Let's see, anything else that we should be touching here? Yeah, I think this is interesting. Again, just going back to the inner child. Okay, so there's actually quite a bit here that is worth touching. This is about the monster. So the separation between good and evil, right? The splitting, the schizoid type is something you'll hear sometimes for this region of the Enneagram, the head triad. There's a splitting. We talked about the splitting of the five, which is more like mind and body splitting. The six splitting is more like good and evil. Evil is outside. And I must be good and I must avoid evil. But this I must be good, evil must be outside, I must be good, that neurotic need is based on a more primordial suspicion that one is bad. Where does one hold that feeling of badness? For the sexual six, quote, they keep and hide within a brutal monster. The counterphobic constructs an intellectual explanation based on which the monster has every reason to exist. They've been unjustly mistreated, they're unjustly misunderstood, they're unjustly abused, they must protect themselves from humanity, which is bad. Based on this approach, they unleash incessant battles advocating against social injustice, for the equality of peoples, for the right of all to exist. But if the monster has to face love, that is when it doesn't know why it exists. In the face of love, the monster is just a scared child who has learned to give up, who feels like one of the demons expelled by God because they were not worthy, who thinks they will never be able to bridge the gap that separates them from the beautiful and worthy beings. Reconstructing the dialogue with the inner child is the only way to transform the monster from a bad child who wishes to see mom and dad dead to a scared child. Okay, so that's a lot, but I think that starts to, and again, there's a lot of overlap here with other types, but the sexual six's monstrosity, it seems like they're maybe more able to contact with that feeling of I must be a monster, right? I must be strong, I must sort of build up this intimidating presence that superficially is trying to be good, but you and I both know there, I feel guilty inside, I feel bad inside, I feel like that monster. The six is probably going to have that feeling of monstrosity more available to them. So if you're working with a sexual six, you start with that intimidation presenting layer. Underneath that is a feeling of guilt and culpability. And then underneath that is a feeling of fear. Anything else we should cover here? Just a lot of good therapeutic stuff, ways to move through, the importance of faith. Access to faith for the counterphobic comes through experiencing being a creature of God, a child like the others, belonging to the supreme family of all. If they can perceive that their origin is not cursed, and that their existence does not depend on who gave birth to them, nor on those around them in the here and now, then they can perceive themselves as a spiritual being. I mean, that sounds pretty good for everyone. Yeah, and I think just closing out here with the loves, they talk about the three loves a lot in this work, which amount to paternal love, maternal love, and erotic love. And here it says, this love, that is their love of great battles and great ideas, they're idealists, they're dreamers. This love leads them to develop empathy and approach the other with compassion. But since they lack maternal love, caritas, the counterphobic can become very protective but not warm. So the six in general, I think they're saying, yeah, I would say that's right. This isn't specific to the sexual six. The six in general of these three loves, it's paternal love. It's the God, the God that you and I know from Renaissance art and from Western. He's a dad. That's That's their love that they are in relationship to most. Even when they're feeling its absence painfully, that's more of the home of the six, this authority figure, this protector. So the six is in that paternal love space, but their work is to get more familiar, I suppose, with the maternal love. Here it says, since they lack maternal love, the counterphobic can become very protective but not warm. To develop truly compassionate love, the counterphobic must go through understanding the bad other who expelled them and through understanding their inner monster. If they manage to see the enemy as a suffering creature, they can recognize the inner child as a tender creature. And in suffering to fight in great battles for them, they may begin to embrace them. Children are happy if someone defends them from abuse, but if no one hugs them, they'll die. So where were we with, we worked our way down the chain. We worked our way from strength, might, the presenting quality of the counterphobic six, into a sense of badness, culpability, monstrosity, into a scared child. And then the easier move for the six in that moment is to show paternal love, to protect that child, to stand up for that child. And then ultimately probably to repeat the cycle, protection, right? I'll protect you, I'll be strong, I won't let anyone hurt you, even if it means I have to be a monster, even if it means I have to rage against others. That's just the passion. But if they take a different approach at that deepest level of vulnerability and put their arm around the child, hold them with tenderness, give them a hug, that's a different way of being. So to develop this level of compassionate understanding, the work on the inner family is very valid. They're talking about the SAT program, but these days we have internal family systems, so much wonderful overlap between these modalities. And then finally, erotic love. So that's maternal love. We just talked about caritas. That's the holding presence, the mothering. Erotic love is certainly the least developed in sixes, even in the sexual six, although it may seem otherwise. So that's really interesting. Again, the way that the sexual six is going to show up in ways that have to be unwound. So even though they're a sexual type, erotic love is the least formed in them. We could say with Freud that the sexuality of the counterphobic is more phallic than genital. I don't think we need to go deep into that. But again, just, the phallus, the strength, the potency and agency, and more on the acting side of experience than receiving. There's enormous taboo around erotic pleasure. For counterphobics, it is easier to have impulsive sexual activity than to surrender to the sweet pleasures of foreplay. It's as if the erection were more important than the orgasm with ejaculation. Hey, look, we're in grad school Enneagram. We got to accept this language. In metaphorical terms, this experience is valid for women as well, right? We're in the world of symbols. We're not literally talking about. Although we might be. That might be a good way to start. The counterphobic is sexually driven to demonstrate power and dominance over the other. This also applies to women, rather than being motivated by enjoying the other. The transformation lies in losing oneself in pleasure, surrendering to the orgasmic and ecstatic pleasure of union with the other, reclaiming erotic love as a passionate and tender experience of union with the whole, with the Supreme. So that's the sexual six, and I'm glad we spent as much time on it as we did, because I feel like this is I feel really connected to a lot of what's being talked about here. And given how common the experience of fear is, I think it's probably something that many of us can connect with, especially those of us who are more on the aggressive or more intense or more, anxious? It's like moving into fight response rather than flight response. So regardless of our Enneagram type, I think there's a lot to take away from the experience of the sexual six. And then I think if you are connecting with this type, then for me the the shocking sort of piece here is just how tricky of a spot the sexual six is in, because there's so much bluster to their character type, and so many of the things that they claim to have, strength, spontaneity, desire, the moral high ground, all of these things are masks protecting them from their deeper feelings of being the exact opposite. So that was the sexual six. We'll keep, I think, the keyword strength. It's just so ubiquitous, but might, strength, shield is too passive, right? We do want a phallic word here, but something like intimidation, I think, is too strong. So we'll just keep it with strength or with might, and remembering too that for the woman sexual six, beauty may be the manifestation of strength rather than actual physical imposing qualities. Okay, we'll wrap up the six next time with the self-preservation six, and look forward to that. See you there.